Hello there, and welcome to Cosmic Slumber. Tonight, instead of drifting through 100 quiet facts, we are going to settle into something a little different, a single long, gentle story, the kind meant to be listened to with your eyes closed, in a warm bed, with the lights already low. It is the story of a very old, very sleepy dragon, and the small village he has quietly watched over for longer than anyone can properly remember. There is no danger in this story. Nothing frightening happens, and nothing needs to be solved in a hurry. It is simply a soft, slow tale about warmth and patience, and small kindnesses passed quietly between a village and the enormous, gentle creature curled above it. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps other sleepy minds find their way here, too, one quiet story at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing slow, deep and even, as we drift together into the story of the sleepy dragon who guarded a cozy village. Let's begin. High in the folded green hills of a valley that most maps forgot to name, there was a small village called Hollow Pines. It had one crooked main street, a scatter of stone cottages with mossy roofs, a mill wheel that turned slowly in a shallow stream, and, curled around the very top of the tallest hill above it, a dragon. His name was Ember, though most of the villagers simply called him Old Ember, the way you might call a favorite armchair old, or a favorite quilt old, with a warmth folded into the word rather than any real complaint. He was the size of a barn, with scales the deep color of a dying campfire, faded here and there to a soft, ashy orange, like coals that had been glowing for so long they had almost forgotten how to be anything else. Ember slept most of the day. This was well known throughout Hollow Pines, and nobody thought it strange at all. He slept curled in a great spiral at the top of the hill, his long tail tucked beneath his chin, his wings folded close against his sides like a blanket he had wrapped around himself a very long time ago and simply never taken off. Smoke rose in slow, lazy curls from his nostrils as he breathed, drifting up into the sky and sometimes forming shapes that the village children liked to lie in the grass and guess at. He had guarded the village for so long that no one alive could remember a time before him. Grandmothers who were once small girls remembered climbing the hill to leave him bundles of dried lavender, back when their own grandmothers had done the very same thing. The stones of the village well had his likeness carved into them, worn soft and round by centuries of curious fingers tracing his shape. Nobody could say, not really, what Ember was guarding the village from. There had not been any real danger in Hollow Pines for as long as anyone could recall. No wolves prowling from the deep woods, no raiders creeping over the eastern ridge, no storms fierce enough to trouble the sturdy stone cottages. Some of the older villagers liked to say that this was precisely the point. A guard who is doing his job well is often mistaken for someone doing nothing at all. And so Ember slept, mostly, through the long golden afternoons, while below him the village went about its small, comfortable business, entirely undisturbed, entirely safe, warmed quietly by something enormous and gentle curled patiently above them. Every evening, just as the sun began to slip behind the western hills and the sky turned the soft orange pink of a fading ember itself, the dragon would wake. He never woke suddenly. There was no great snort, no dramatic shudder. His enormous eyelids, the color of amber held up to firelight, would simply open slowly, one and then the other, blinking away the last threads of sleep the way a person blinks away a particularly comfortable dream. Then Ember would rise, unfolding himself joint by joint, first his long neck, then his wings, then finally his tail, until he stood at his full height at the very peak of the hill, silhouetted against the darkening sky. From there, he could see the whole of Hollow Pines laid out below him, every rooftop, every chimney, every lantern beginning to flicker to life in a cottage window. This was his evening walk, though calling it a walk was perhaps generous, since Ember's idea of walking mostly involved a slow, deliberate pacing along the ridge of the hill, his great head turning this way and that, his nostrils gently testing the evening air. He was checking, in his own unhurried way, that everything below was exactly as it should be. The smoke from the baker's chimney, the soft clang of the blacksmith closing his shop for the night, the particular, familiar creak of the mill wheel slowing to its evening stop. Satisfied, he would settle onto his haunches at the hill's crest, and there he would stay for most of the night, a great warm shape against the stars, while the village below drifted, one lantern at a time, toward sleep. The villagers of Hollow Pines had, over many generations, developed a whole quiet culture of small kindnesses toward their dragon. It had started, so the story went, many lifetimes ago, when a particularly cold winter had left Ember's usual napping spot buried under snow, and a shepherd named Myra had climbed the hill with an armful of old quilts, simply because it seemed like the kind thing to do. Ember had been so touched by the gesture that he had, the following spring, gently redirected a landslide away from Myra's flock with one careful sweep of his tail. And so the tradition began, quietly, without anyone ever deciding it formally. The village looked after the dragon in small ways, and the dragon looked after the village in return, and neither side ever made a great fuss about it. Now, generations later, the tradition looked like this. Each evening, as the sun set and Ember began his slow walk along the ridge, a different household would send someone up the hill with a small offering. Not payment, exactly, and not quite a gift either, but something in between, the way you might bring a cup of tea to a friend who is minding your house while you are away. Some nights it was a warm loaf of bread from the baker, still soft enough that the crust gave gently under Ember's enormous but surprisingly careful claws. Some nights it was a bundle of the same dried lavender that had once wrapped around it centuries before, which Ember liked to breathe in slowly before curling up for the night, filling his great lungs with the soft, dusty scent. Some nights it was simply a child, sent up with strict instructions to say goodnight and nothing more, who would sit for a while at the foot of the dragon's enormous curled tail and tell him, in the careful, rambling way of small children, everything that had happened that day. Ember loved these small visits more than almost anything else in his long, slow life. He was, despite his size and his age and the centuries of quiet duty stretching out behind him, a fundamentally sleepy and fundamentally affectionate creature, and there was nothing he enjoyed quite so much as the particular warmth of being visited, gently and without ceremony, by someone who trusted him completely. There was a boy in the village, at the time this story takes place, named Pip. Pip was 7 years old, with a gap where his two front teeth used to be and a habit of narrating his own thoughts slightly under his breath as he walked. Pip lived with his grandmother, above the little shop where she mended shoes, and every third evening, when it was his family's turn, it was Pip who climbed the hill to visit Ember. He always brought the same thing, a small wooden cup of warm milk, which his grandmother insisted was entirely too small a gift for such an enormous dragon, and which Ember insisted, every single time, was exactly the right size. "You could bring a whole barrel," Ember told him once, his enormous voice rumbling low and gentle, like distant thunder heard through a closed window, "and I would still only want the cup. It is not really about the milk, little one." Pip had considered this very seriously, sitting cross-legged in the flattened grass beside Ember's curled tail, and had eventually said, "Is it about the visit, then?" "It is about the visit," Ember agreed, and something in his great amber eyes had softened in a way Pip did not have the words for yet, though he would understand it better many years later, once he was grown and had small quiet visits of his own to look back on fondly. One particular autumn, the kind where the leaves along the eastern ridge turned the deep, rich colors of a sunset caught in the trees, something slightly out of the ordinary happened in Hollow Pines. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that would trouble the sleep of any careful listener, but it was enough of a small ripple in the village's quiet routine that everyone remembered it clearly for years afterward. A traveler arrived. This alone was not unusual. Travelers passed through Hollow Pines now and then, following the old road that wound down from the northern hills toward the larger towns beyond the valley. What was unusual was that this particular traveler, an elderly woman with a heavy pack and a walking stick worn smooth from years of use, arrived just as the light was fading, tired and turned around, having taken a wrong branch of the road somewhere in the fading afternoon light. She found her way into the village square just as most of the cottage windows were beginning to glow warm and gold, and she stood there for a moment, looking lost in the particular, gentle way of someone who is tired but not afraid, simply uncertain of exactly where to rest her feet next. It was the baker, a round, cheerful woman named Hetty, who noticed her first, and who came bustling out from behind her counter with the particular brisk kindness of someone used to feeding travelers before asking too many questions. Within a few minutes, the traveler, whose name turned out to be Old Fenner, was seated by the bakery's warm hearth with a cup of tea and a slice of the evening's last loaf, her heavy pack set down at last beside her tired feet. But here is the small, gentle heart of this part of the story. As the villagers gathered, as they always did, to welcome the stranger properly, someone glanced up toward the top of the hill and noticed that Ember had paused, mid-stride along his evening ridge walk, his great head turned toward the village square below, watching. He had, of course, noticed the traveler the moment she arrived. Dragons notice most things. But he had also noticed, in the particular unhurried way that comes from centuries of careful watching, that she was tired rather than troubled, and that the village was already gathering around her with exactly the right kind of warmth, and so he had done nothing at all except watch, quietly, from a comfortable distance, ready to help only if help turned out to be needed. It was Pip, small and quick, who was sent up the hill that evening to explain things properly, since it happened to be his family's turn for the visit anyway, and since his grandmother thought Ember would want to know. "There's a traveler," Pip reported, settling into his usual spot beside Ember's tail, the small wooden cup of warm milk balanced carefully in both hands. "Her name is Old Fenner. She got turned around on the northern road. Hetty's given her tea and bread, and Mr. Pell says she can sleep in the room above the mill tonight, since it's empty and it's warm." Ember considered this for a long moment, his great eyes half-closed in the particular way that meant he was thinking rather than sleeping, though the two looks were, admittedly, quite similar on him. "Is she frightened?" he asked eventually. Travelers sometimes are, arriving somewhere new after dark. Pip thought about this seriously, the way he thought about most things Ember asked him. I don't think so, he said finally. She looked mostly just tired. And this, in its own quiet way, was one of the most important things about Ember, and about the whole gentle system he and the village had built together over so many generations. He did not rush toward every small disturbance. He did not feel the need to swoop down from his hill at the first sign of anything unfamiliar. He trusted the village to handle its own small, everyday troubles, the way any good guardian eventually learns to trust the people they are guarding, and he saved his own particular strength for the moments that genuinely needed it. Old Fenna stayed in Hollow Pines for 3 days, resting her tired feet and mending a worn strap on her pack, before continuing on her journey toward the towns beyond the valley. On her last evening in the village, she asked, rather shyly, whether it might be possible to see the dragon she had heard so much about during her short stay, and so the whole village walked her partway up the hill together, lanterns swinging gently in the deepening dusk. Ember, who had been watching their slow procession up the hillside for some time already, met them at a comfortable distance from his usual resting spot, lowering his great head so that his amber eyes were nearly level with old Fenna's own tired, kind ones. They tell me you took a wrong turn, Ember said, his voice its usual low, warm rumble. I did, old Fenna admitted, with the easy laugh of someone long past being embarrassed by such small mistakes. But I seem to have found rather a nice place to be lost in. That, said Ember, with what might, on a dragon, be called a smile, is generally the idea. She left the following morning, well-rested and well-fed, with a fresh loaf from Hetty's bakery tucked into her mended pack, and the whole village waved from the square until she disappeared around the bend in the northern road. It was a small story, in the end, nothing more than a tired traveller finding a warm welcome, but it was retold often in Hollow Pines in the years that followed, usually on especially quiet evenings, as an example of the particular kind of watching Ember did best. Not swooping, not roaring, simply watching, warmly, and trusting the good people below him to handle most things perfectly well on their own. As autumn deepened into winter, the nights in Hollow Pines grew longer and colder, and the whole village settled into its particular winter rhythm, the one that had repeated itself, more or less unchanged, for as many generations as anyone could count. Smoke curled thicker from every chimney. The mill wheel slowed nearly to stillness as the stream began to edge with frost. And Ember, whose great warm body had always run comfortably hot, no matter the season, began spending his nights curled a little closer to the village below, his long tail draped down the hillside in a great, gentle curve that seemed, more than one villager had noticed over the years, to trace something very close to the shape of an embrace. It was, by pure coincidence, Pip's family's turn to visit the hill that evening, and his grandmother had bundled him so thoroughly against the cold that he could barely bend his arms enough to hold the small wooden cup of warm milk properly. He trudged up the snow-covered hillside slowly, his boots leaving deep, careful prints behind him, until he reached the familiar curled shape of Ember at the top, snow already gathering softly along the ridges of his great folded wings. You'll catch cold, Pip announced, in the serious, slightly bossy tone he sometimes used with adults he was fond of, sitting out here in all this snow. Ember let out a low, rumbling sound that might, in a smaller creature, have been called a chuckle. Dragons do not catch cold, little one. We run warmer than a half-fire, most of us, even in the deepest winter. Though I confess, he added, glancing down at Pip's thoroughly bundled shape, I am glad someone thought to wrap you up properly before sending you out into all of this. Pip settled into his usual spot, though tonight, with the snow falling so thickly and the cold pressing in from every side, he found himself shuffling a little closer to the warm curve of Ember's tail than usual, until he was leaning, quite comfortably, against the dragon's great warm side. They sat together like that for a long while, watching the snow fall silently over the whole sleeping valley below, the village windows glowing warm and gold beneath their blanket of white, the whole scene so quiet and so peaceful that Pip found his eyes growing heavy far sooner than usual. Tell me something, Pip said eventually, his voice already soft and slow with encroaching sleep. Do you ever get tired of watching? Every single night, for so many years. Ember considered this question carefully, the way he considered most things Pip asked him, turning it over slowly in his great, old mind before answering. I do not think of it as watching, exactly, he said finally. Not the way you might watch for danger, waiting anxiously for something terrible to happen. I think of it more like this, little one. Imagine you love something very much, a person, a place, a whole valley full of warm little lights in the snow. Would it feel tiring to simply sit nearby that thing you loved, and let it be safe, and let it be warm, and let it grow and change in its own good time? Pip, who was very close to sleep by then, considered this with the last of his waking thoughts. No, he murmured eventually. That would just feel nice. Just so, said Ember softly, and he curled his great tail a little more snugly around the small, sleepy shape beside him, careful, as always, of his own considerable strength. That is rather closer to what it feels like, most nights. Not a duty, exactly. More like sitting quietly beside something you love, for as long as it needs you to. Pip did not remember, afterward, being carried back down the snowy hillside that night, tucked securely against Ember's warm chest as the dragon made his careful, gentle way down toward the village, nor being handed, still half asleep, into his grandmother's waiting arms at the bottom of the hill. He only remembered, faintly, the low rumble of Ember's voice, and the particular soft warmth of snow falling silently all around them, and the deep, settled feeling of being watched over by something enormous and ancient and entirely, endlessly gentle. Winter eventually gave way, as it always did, to the first soft green edges of spring, and Hollow Pine settled back into its familiar rhythms, the mill wheel turning again, the cottage gardens slowly waking beneath the thawing frost. Ember's evening walks along the ridge grew longer and more leisurely as the days lengthened, and the small nightly visits continued, exactly as they always had, one household at a time, one small offering at a time, one quiet conversation at a time. The village never did learn exactly what, if anything, Ember was truly guarding them from. Perhaps, as some of the older villagers like to suggest, there had once been a real and pressing danger, long, long ago, something serious enough to need a dragon's watchful presence, something that had faded so completely from memory that only the guarding itself remained. Or perhaps, as others preferred to believe, the guarding had never really been about danger at all, not truly, but about something quieter and steadier, the simple, patient act of choosing, night after night, to sit beside something you love and let it be warm. Either way, it hardly seemed to matter, not to the village, and certainly not to Ember himself. Each evening, as the sun slipped down behind the western hills, he woke slowly from his long day's sleep, unfolded himself joint by joint, and took up his familiar place along the ridge, watching the small, warm lights of Hollow Pines flicker to life below him, one cottage window at a time. And each night, as the village drifted, one lantern at a time, towards sleep, Ember settled back down at the top of his hill, curled his long tail into its familiar spiral, tucked his chin against his chest, and slept the deep, contented sleep of something very old, and very loved, and entirely, gently, at peace. Spring in Hollow Pines brought with it the lambing season, and with the lambing season came a small, particular kind of worry that settled over the village every year around the same time, gentle enough never to keep anyone awake at night, but present all the same, the way a familiar draught might be present in an old house. The villagers' flocks grazed on the terraced pastures that climbed partway up the eastern side of the valley, well tended and well fenced, but spring pastures were still spring pastures, full of new grass and new lambs unsteady on their legs, and every year, without fail, at least one small lamb managed to wander further than it should. That particular spring, it was a lamb belonging to the shepherd Thomas, a small, curious creature with one black ear and one white one, who had wriggled beneath a loose section of fence rail during the soft blue hour just before dawn and gone wandering off toward the tree line, following, as lambs sometimes do, nothing more sensible than its own curiosity. By the time Thomas noticed the gap in his flock, the sun was already well up, and a light mist had settled over the lower slopes of the valley, the kind that made it difficult to see very far in any direction. He searched for over an hour on his own, calling and whistling, before word finally reached the village square that a lamb had gone missing, and might, if it had wandered as far as the old tree line, be quite lost indeed. It was Pip's grandmother, of all people, who suggested, in her calm and practical way, that perhaps a dragon's nose, which could apparently detect a baking loaf from clear across the valley, might be rather useful in finding one small, particular lamb. Ember was, of course, awake by then, since the sun was well up and dragons, whatever their sleeping habits, are rarely quite so sound asleep as they might first appear. He had, in fact, already noticed the small commotion in the village square from his hilltop and had been quietly wondering whether he might be needed, in the patient, unhurried way that came naturally to him after so many centuries of watching. When Thomas himself climbed the hill, breathless and a little embarrassed at having to ask, Ember simply unfolded himself at once, without the slightest hint of complaint about being woken early from his usual daytime rest. A lamb with one black ear and one white one, Ember repeated thoughtfully, lowering his great head so that his nostrils were nearly level with the misty pastures below. Small things like that leave their own particular scent behind them, you know, especially when they are frightened and a little bit lost. Give me a moment. And so, for the first time in a great many years, the whole village watched as Ember rose fully into the sky, his enormous wings unfolding with a great soft rush of displaced air, and glided slowly and carefully over the misty lower slopes of the valley, his head turning this way and that, his nostrils testing the damp morning air with obvious concentration. It did not take him very long at all. Within a quarter of an hour, he had circled back low over the village, calling down in his great rumbling voice that the lamb had wandered into a shallow hollow near the old tree line, quite unharmed but thoroughly startled by the mist, and was, at that very moment, huddled beneath a fallen log waiting for someone kind to come and fetch it. Thomas found it exactly where Ember had said, trembling but perfectly well, and carried it back to the pasture cradled against his chest, while the whole village, gathered in the square to hear the outcome, cheered and clapped in the warm, relieved way of people who had been quietly worried about something small and had just been given very good news. That evening, it was Thomas's turn, gratefully, to climb the hill with the family's offering, and he brought, alongside the usual small gift, a length of soft wool ribbon tied around one of the lamb's own curls of fleece, pressed into Ember's great claws with a murmured thanks that meant a great deal more than the small gesture might have suggested. It was nothing so very difficult, Ember told him gently, turning the small woolen token over carefully between two enormous claws. A dragon's nose is good for more than smelling fresh bread, you know, though I will admit that is still my favorite use for it. It wasn't nothing to us, Thomas said simply, and Ember, who had heard some version of those same words many, many times across many, many years, found that they never once grew old to hear. Summer arrived, as it always did, warm and golden and thick with the hum of bees in the pasture clover, and with it came the village's favorite season for a particular kind of evening ritual that had nothing at all to do with worry, and everything to do with simple, shared enjoyment. On the warmest, clearest summer nights, when the sky above hollow pines turned that deep, soft blue-black scattered thickly with stars, it had become tradition for the village children to climb the hill together, not on any particular family's turn, but all together, in a loose, giggling group, carrying blankets and small lanterns, to lie in the flattened grass beside Ember's great curled shape and watch the stars come out. Ember loved these summer nights more than he generally let on. There was something in the particular warmth of a whole cluster of small children settled trustingly against his sides, all talking at once about shapes in the stars and half-remembered stories and the small important dramas of their daily lives, that filled something in him words did not quite reach.